Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're doing well. So this is Lecture 2 of Week 2 of TED 007, Second Language Acquisition. Today we are going to be focusing on cognitivist approaches to second language acquisition. We've got a decent bit of ground to cover, so I'm going to go ahead and dive right in. As always, starting with a couple of reminders. One, make sure that you've completed the weekly readings before you complete any of the assignments, as those will serve as a foundation for these. Also, make sure that you review the assignment sheet for Journal 1 and Discussion Board 1. Those are on Blackboard now, as are the assignment sheets, or the preliminary assignment sheets, I should say, for the classroom observation assignment and the teaching portfolio, teaching toolkit, and teaching philosophy assignment. So, as I stated, we're starting off with cognitivist approaches to second language acquisition. We previewed these somewhat during the first week of class, and we have that kind of basic definition of a cognitivist approach as an approach to SLA that is grounded in cognitive psychology and focuses on influencing mental schema through formal learning encounters. Right, so that's kind of our basic definition. In order to actually dig a little bit deeper into this topic, we're going to need a more robust definition than that. And so I'm going to turn to the work of Dr. Dwight Atkinson to help come up with that. What we're going to be looking at will be coming from his 2011 book, Alternative Approaches to Second Language Acquisition. Some of you may recall that Dr. Atkinson is not a cognitivist himself. He is a socio-cognitivist. So if cognitive approaches to SLA come out of this larger educational moment that was grounded in the tenets of cognitive psychology, a socio-cognitivist attempts to marry cognitivist perspectives with social perspectives. Right? So according to Dwight Atkinson, cognitivism can be used to identify a theoretical framework in which we have two major pillars that theoretical framework is going to be organized around. The first major pillar is that the mind or the brain is, for all intents and purposes, the necessary and sufficient locus of human thought. Right, and you'll notice it has the mind/brain. There are reasons for this. It goes back to the Cartesian divide between mind and body, where mind is that consciousness that human beings possess through which they process lived experiences, and the brain is the physical machinery, the gray matter and the neurons and the electrical impulses that are actually carrying out this work. The second pillar of all cognitive frameworks, then, is that thought and learning are a form of information processing. Right. Now, what happens during this information processing and how that's carried out will vary from theoretical approach to theoretical approach, but at its core, it's about encountering stimuli, applying cognitive and metacognitive strategies to that stimuli to make sense of it, right? So let's go ahead and dig a little bit deeper into this, because another thing that Atkinson 2012 gives us is a kind of a deep dive breakdown of cognitivist approaches to SLA. Cognitivist. There we go. As you can see, very hard to type and talk at the same time. Nope. That's right. Okay. It's a deep dive breakdown of cognitivist approaches, and while not all of them are directly applicable to what we're doing in education and language education, I do feel that enough of them are relevant that I want to go through them briefly here, because understanding the different elements of a cognitivist framework will help us then to identify, when we're looking at a teaching practice, that has cognitivism as its foundation, or we're looking at a theoretical framework, a theoretical approach, and we're not sure whether it's cognitivist or social or socio-cognitivist or eco-social, what have you, understanding the different elements of just a generic cognitivist approach can be very helpful in this regard. So the primary sort of facet or property of a cognitivist approach is that it views the mind as a computer, right? In this regards, cognition is a form of information processing that's dominantly uniform. We take input, we process it, and we produce output, much like we would with a computer, right? So in this metaphor, or if you see any metaphors in a theoretical framework that reference computers and computing, it's very likely a cognitivist one. But in this metaphor, then, the mind becomes like the CPU, the central processing unit of the computer. It may come preloaded with a certain instruction set, right? Or we may layer on additional instruction sets, additional functionality through programs. We provide it that cognition device then with some sort of input, some sort of stimulus, whether it be linguistic, ecological, social, what have you. This gets processed through that machinery and interpreted through that framework or through that lens of whatever program we're running, right? And then we produce output from that. Now, related to this is the notion of representationalism, right? This is the idea that all thought, all cognition is based off of, that the primary unit of cognition is based off of, or can be interpreted as some sort of symbolic system, right? So knowledge is stored internally as representations of something else, right? So we're not storing directly a dog or a specific dog. Instead, we're storing a symbolic representation of that thing that then gets applied in new circumstances, right? The other big element of cognitivist approaches that are distinctly important for us is the idea of learning as abstract knowledge acquisition, right? So cognitivist approaches will look at learning as a process through which a stimulus is encountered, oftentimes in a highly structured environment, such as an instructional environment in the classroom or an HR training session, right? It will then work to internalize that new knowledge using these ideas of representationalism, right? And so then what ends up happening during learning is we're just acquiring new bits of abstract knowledge that we can then apply to new situations, right? So what this means then is that while we may encounter concretized forms of knowledge, for example, your course textbook, this lecture, etc., knowledge in the purest sense only exists as an abstract representation in the mind. Another key element of cognitivist approaches to language learning and teaching is the centrality of language, right? And what we mean by this is that language serves as the primary vehicle through which cognition occurs and can then be shared with others, right? So then what this means is that the way that we make sense of the world, according to cognitivist views, is through language and through linguistic systems, right? It also then means that we use language as part of that symbolic system through which we encode knowledge and through which we then engage in knowledge acquisition or learning, right? So one of the implications of this then connects second language acquisition with sociolinguistics, and particularly what's called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, right? If you don't have any background in sociolinguistics, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis has a strong form and a weak form. In its strong form, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is basically language determines how we view the world. In its weak form, it's that language influences how we make sense of the world around us, right? And there's a subtle difference here, but an important one. Most sociolinguists, most applied linguists that I know would immediately reject a strong form of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis as being overly deterministic and stripping away a great deal of human agency. Most of us, however, would accept a weak form of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, this idea that language influences how we see the world. Okay. The kind of quintessential example of this is how different languages encode something like time or motion, right? So if you look at many Native American languages, for example, Cherokee comes to mind, the way that time is encoded in Cherokee linguistically is different than the way it's encoded in English. So the weak form of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis would say then that the qualitative experience of the passage of time will have subtle difference for the native Cherokee speaker versus the native English speaker, right? And many of us would be willing to accept this. And we can extend this idea of the centrality of language to view then sort of language as a code, right? Or language as a programming language. So if you're familiar at all with computer sciences, you know that a language like C# is often used for programming operating systems, while C++ may be used for high-end applications like Word and PowerPoint, right? Meanwhile, Java will oftentimes be used for smaller applications or highly portable applications. Meanwhile, Python and R are typically used for machine learning and data science applications, right? So with cognitivist approaches, we can then also view language similarly, right? And we can view different languages as just different programming languages through which cognition will oftentimes be run. One that's slightly less important to us as educators is this idea of scientism, but it does begin to explain the form that cognitivist research takes. Scientism here just means that cognitivist approaches tend to try to replicate or model themselves after the hard sciences, right? So things like biology, chemistry, physics, etc. And so oftentimes when a researcher deploys a cognitivist framework, they'll attempt to use things like quasi-experimental research design where they have a control group and a treatment group. That's all well and good, but when we're working with human subjects, especially doing educational research with human subjects, this becomes a little bit stickier. And one of the reasons it becomes stickier is because educational research projects tend to have very small sample sizes. And it's nowhere near the sample size you would need to say that you have a representative sample or to then generalize those findings out beyond that research population. Another sort of core tenet of most cognitivist approaches is the notion of substance dualism and functionalism. Right? So we'll start with functionalism, and for this I'm going to call on the work of Andy Clark, who is a cognitive scientist, right? Who defines functionalism as the idea that cognition can, and for some, must, be understood apart from its physical instantiations. Right? This, if you're familiar with the work of René Descartes, is kind of the ultimate endpoint of the Cartesian divide between mind and body, right? So oftentimes in cognitivist approaches, we will see researchers and theorists either explicitly or implicitly embrace this idea that we can excise out the mind and cognitive processes from its social setting or from its social relevance, right? And that we must necessarily then understand these two things separately. Related to that is this idea of substance dualism, right? Which means here then that cognition can be implemented across a variety of media, but but that implementation of it is not our primary focus. The function is, right? So substance dualism. Implemented across multiple media. And this gives rise to notions like cognitive affordances. So as you're teaching, your lesson plan that you carry with you, that you have open in front of you as you move through your lesson or off to the side as you move through your lesson, this is an example of you having offloaded some of that cognitive labor onto a physical media, right? Those lecture notes represent the output of a cognitive process. If, like me, you oftentimes have a lot of appointments that you're balancing for work and for family, and personally, then you may make use of a paper day planner, or you may make use of a calendar app. This is just one more example of how cognition can be implemented across multiple media. One of the issues here is that cognitivist approaches would say, okay, we can ignore that particular fact of human existence and focus just on what's happening inside the mind of the learner, right? And this necessarily shuts us off from a lot of what's actually happening during the process of language learning, language acquisition. Excuse me. Another element of this is something called the subject-object dualism. This one's getting a little bit too far into high theory for me, and I would say not directly relevant to what we do as educators, but this is again part of that Cartesian divide, in as much as the mind, the object of our research, is out there. It's the thing that we're seeking to observe and gather data on. Meanwhile, the other elements of human experience, of especially subjective human experience, are things that we would seek to discard. Another way to identify cognitivist approaches is by how they handle reductionism, right? So this is how we move, excuse me. This is how we start to move then from a specific set of cases to something more general, right? Or said another way, reductionism is how we come to understand how a specific set of cognitive processes may transfer to a more general explanatory framework, right? So this would be doing things like think aloud protocols with students while they work through, for example, a word problem in a math class. And then taking the outputs of that, understanding sort of the metacognitive processes as well as the procedural processes or procedural cognition that happens there, as far as the actual steps you have to go through to execute that math problem, and then generalizing that out to a larger explanatory framework. The final, excuse me, or I should say the penultimate property of cognitivist views of language acquisition and teaching is this idea of aggregatism, right? That we can take a group of individuals and from that develop frameworks to explain individual behavior or, in our case, learning. The final element of most cognitivist approaches is this idea of decompositionalism, or that complex tasks, particularly complex cognitive tasks, can be broken down into their constituent parts, right? And this is part of the reason why a lot of cognitivist-based approaches to second language acquisition, if we look at studies that are built on that cognitivist foundation, they'll oftentimes be attempting to look at just an individual language process. So they'll just be looking at morpheme acquisition, or they'll just be looking at articulator activation, right? So pronunciation. Articulators are those parts of the mouth that move to make sound, like mine is doing now, right? So these 10 areas give us kind of the basic properties of cognitivist approaches to second language acquisition. So let's take a look at one of those foundational cognitivist approaches, which was Krashen's 1982 monitor model, right? This is a model that Krashen and his students started developing back in the late 60s, early 70s, but it wasn't until this 82 article that it was, more widely formalized. That being said, however, it is one that has seen considerable critique since the 1980s. It is, however, still an important foundation in second language acquisition, and is oftentimes seen as kind of the starting point for more modern theories, right? The first element of Krashen's monitor model is the acquisition learning hypothesis, right? What you'll recall from your reading, this hypothesis just suggests that there's a distinction between acquiring a language and learning a language, and ideally we need both, right? So there are certain things that we can that will happen through acquisition, through this unconscious sort of experiencing of a language, and there's a different set of knowledge that's better gained through explicit instruction and learning. In other parts of the monitor model, knowledge that is explicitly learned may be used to monitor or to do hypothesis testing on different elements of the L2 learner's output, right? This is stuff that they'll largely do on their own. The second part of this, then, of course, is the monitor hypothesis itself, right? And the monitor hypothesis is basically just saying that L2 learners are oftentimes engaging in self-monitoring of their L2 output, and they'll oftentimes be using learned knowledge to function as that monitor and to engage in necessary repair when they need to. Then there's the natural order hypothesis. This is one that's been heavily problematized because originally this was largely based off of first language acquisition, but this is the idea that there is kind of a natural flow to how acquisition in a second language works. For example, articles tend to be one of the last things that are fully acquired. Meanwhile, some basic uses and basic morphological elements may be acquired sooner. For example, the simple past tense of ed. Another element of the monitor model is the comprehensible input hypothesis. This is one that's really stuck with the field of second language acquisition the longest, and probably in a form most closely resembling Krashen's original, which is this idea that learners have to have comprehensible input in order to learn something and in order to acquire something. So they have to understand the vast majority of what they're being exposed to in that input. However, Krashen gives us this idea of I+1. So the input needs to be at a level that the learner understands, but some elements of it need to be just beyond their comfortable level of comprehension in order to facilitate acquisition processes and growth. The final part of the monitor model, and one that oftentimes resonates very well with novice educators, is this idea of the affective filter, right? And the affective filter is just saying, hey, Internal emotional state, internal psychic state plays a role in language acquisition, and part of our job as educators is to lower that affective filter to create classroom environments where learners feel comfortable and safe so that they can make contributions and so that they can produce output, right? So this has been kind of one of the foundational cognitivist theories in the field of SLA. It's the touchstone that many educators are exposed to. However, that does not at all mean that it is the only sort of version of this, right? There's been a lot of critique and development of cognitivist views since Stephen Krashen, and one of, if not the most important element of this is the idea of information processing, right? And here for information processing, we're going to be pulling from a couple of different places. This will come from McLaughlin, 1987, who originated the idea. I'll be summarizing some work from Miles and Mitchell's, or Mitchell and Miles, I'm sorry, I always get the author order mixed up there, 2004. And then there's also been some contributions from Schmidt, and that was 2001 for more recent interpretations of that, right? And so when we're talking about information processing, we're talking about how the mind moves through the input that it's encountering and how some of that might be internalized into either learning in the case of explicit instructional context or acquisition in the case of unconscious learning. And so because of this, it's important to understand some of the characteristics of information processing. The first is that humans are autonomous and active learners, right? Prior to this, it was often thought that students were these kind of inert lumps of clay in the classroom that the teacher then molded into the shapes that they needed through their instruction. Cognitivist views that are based off this idea of information processing, however, accept that learners are an active component in the teaching and learning process, in as much as they are actively processing the input provided by the teacher, performing hypothesis testing against their inbuilt sort of syllabus of language and of language acquisition, right? And then they are producing spontaneous output, right? This idea of humans being autonomous learners is that one, learning can happen without, or not learning, but acquisition can happen without conscious effort, but also that human agents have some sort of agency over the learning process and some sort of control over it. Another sort of element of information processing is the idea that the mind is a general purpose symbol processing system, right? So the brain itself, the mind itself did not originally necessarily evolve to interpret symbolic input, for example, language, but it is an ability that has been, or a system that has been layered on top of this general cognitive framework that is innate to human beings. Another element of information processing approaches is that complex behavior is comprised of simpler processes, and these processes are modular, right? So in an information processing approach, even something like reading comprehension can be broken down into a simpler sub-collection of processes, right? So when we think about reading comprehension, it's not just understanding the content that's there, it's understanding the individual words. Beyond the individual words is understanding how those words are related to each other through word order and syntactic structure. Beyond word order and syntactic structure, it's understanding how these things come together in the constraints of genre, right, to imbue additional meaning into that text, right? And beyond understanding the genre effects, it's then also understanding things like authorial intent and reader response to a text. So in an information processing approach, we would break down this very complex process of reading comprehension into these constituent parts. And one could argue we could go even smaller than words to understand letters and writing systems as well, because not every language uses an alphabetic writing system, right? And this can introduce different issues. The other element of this, then, is that these individual processes can be moved into other larger tasks. So, for example, we can take that sort of sub-process of rhetorical understanding, take it out of the context of reading comprehension, plug it into something like analyzing discourse, right? So looking at things like political speeches, or looking at things like advertising and other forms of standardized discourse. Another element of the information processing approach is that these component processes that we're talking about can be studied independently. And that by looking at things in isolation, so by looking at things like phonological acquisition of new sounds in isolation from things like means of articulation or modes of articulation, we're not going to lose any information. It's not going to negatively impact our ability to understand how these things work together. And this is where we start to see that scientism come in a little bit more, and this is where things start to get a little bit stickier for us. Another key element about information processing approaches is that they understand that processing of this information, of this input, takes time, and that amount of time is not necessarily closely correlated to task complexity or to proficiency level, right? This means that it's very difficult to then judge how long a particular bit of language processing or information processing should take for the learner. But it does mean that this isn't an instantaneous process. Related to that, then, is this idea that the mind is a limited capacity processor. Right? So what this then tells us, is that in an information processing approach, we accept the fact that things like our learners being distracted or not paying attention to particular input may mean that acquisition or learning doesn't happen in that particular case, right? This notion of information processing is one that undergirds all cognitivist theoretical approaches. Another very important part of this, then, is the issue of noticing, right? This comes to us originally from Schmidt, again in the I think he originally started talking about this back in the early 90s and then formalized it in the 2000s, but this notion of noticing is basically that learners have to be able to consciously attend to the input that they're seeing, right? So learners have to be able to first perceive that input and then make sense of it before they can fully internalize that input for learning and acquisition purposes, right? So that was a particular example that I wanted to share with you that I am now having trouble finding. All right, well, I'll have to find that for us later then, I guess, right? But just to summarize, noticing with Schmidt, again, this is about 1982, I believe, that this first came around, or 1986 in its original, and then 2003, I believe, in a later form, that we see this idea of noticing really start to take off. But this is, again, that idea that in order for learning to occur, before learners can even begin to process that information, their attention has to be drawn to specific linguistic forms, and those are the linguistic forms that we would be focusing on in a particular lesson, right? Now, one of the issues with this, of course, then, is that we can't really control what our learners notice. And even if we scaffold that noticing through things like specialized formatting or information gap activities, because the learner is autonomous and has agency over that learning process, then they may, they may not actually attend to the information that we want them to. Sorry, there we go. Those were the correct dates for that. And then a clearer form of this is that nothing is learned unless it is first noticed, right? The pedagogical implication then, of course, being that what we're attempting to do is to get our learners to attend to or pay attention to specific things. Now, more recently, we've seen the rise of a very particular form of sociocultural theory. I don't like calling it this because there's a separate branch of SLA that is sociocultural theory. This is particularly referring to Vygotskian sociocultural theory. And what Vygotskian sociocultural theory gives to SLA is this idea that our learners have to move through something called the zone of proximal development. Right, the zone of proximal development, or ZPD, is that I+1, or is an extended version of that I+1 from Stephen Krashen's monitor hypothesis, right? So for a Vygotskian sociocultural model, then what we're saying is that internalization of learning can only occur when the student or the learner engages with an interlocutor in this zone of proximal development, right? So at that I+1 level where they're receiving input that's slightly beyond their learned and acquired linguistic abilities. But that interlocutor is then able to scaffold and to engage in repair and clarification during the communicative event. And it's this act here of having that additional support from their interlocutor that then leads to or contributes to acquisition and learning. This was expanded on more by James Landolf, but James Landolf has taken sociocultural theory in a slightly different direction than I think Vygotsky originally intended. And we've actually seen a lot of evolution in how Landolf interprets sociocultural theory in SLA in recent years, and we'll actually be spending a little bit more time with that. Another sort of avenue of cognitivist theories that are out there are complexity theory and dynamic system theories, right? And this is from Diane Larson Freeman. And that was originally, 1997? That was a really hard article to read. It was tough. She reinterpreted it a little bit in 2011 in an Alternative Approaches book. But then we get dynamic systems theories from, who was that? DeBott and some of their colleagues. And that was in 2005. Right. And so basically what this says is that, one, language is a complex system comprised of many working parts, right? And that the relationship between these different subparts is also complex. And additionally, that language, and of course its subsystems, is a dynamic system. So that is, they change over time and they change across context, right? So this, as an educational model, leads to a couple of endpoints. The first is, of course, understanding that language and language learning are both therefore complex systems that are deeply embedded in their social and cultural settings, right? And because of this, we need to understand how interconnected systems influence each other, right? So we can't necessarily, in this version of a cognitivist view of SLA from Complexity and Dynamic Systems series, we can't divorce the learner or teaching from social context, because social context has some influence on language learning. And likewise, language learning can then have its own influence on that individual's social context. A really important notion that we get from complexity theory and dynamic systems theory is this idea that development is nonlinear, right? So we talked about this a little bit during the first class, this idea that especially for interrupted learners, we may see language skill atrophy. But this is also true of non-interrupted learners, right? As a student's working to acquire English, that is not a linear better and better and better process. They may encounter new ways of using that language or new context where their pre-existing knowledge doesn't necessarily fit with what's being demanded of them in that new task. The final major part then, of course, is that dynamic nature of complex systems, right? And so then part of what this means is when we're thinking about development and the learner, that we're not looking for continual improvement, but we're looking at change over time, right? And that change may be for the better or that change may be for the worse, right? And that change can then be attributed to not just necessarily the classroom instruction, but then to possibly social elements as well, or some combination therein. One of the big ways that we see complexity theory applied in the classroom is this idea that learners need to be provided with repeated exposure to language, and that exposure needs to occur in authentic ways, right? So a complexity theory approach to, for example, ESL reading would say that our learners shouldn't be reading summaries of research papers, they should be reading research papers themselves, but we as the educator may need to provide additional scaffolding, for example, vocabulary lists or separate explanation and paraphrase, right? There's been some research to suggest that when learners engage with authentic materials, whether that be a research paper or a video, for example, that this can facilitate acquisition in part because it helps control for things like motivation, right? Or it can help control for things like motivation. Also, learners then begin to feel, according to some researchers, somewhat empowered because they're consuming authentic materials instead of specialized ESL materials that are then separating them from the general population, right? They're actually engaging with real text, right? So these are some of the this is an overview, I should say, of cognitivist approaches to second language acquisition and some of the big ones. I would say that complexity theory, dynamic systems theories, and sociocultural theory are probably the most dominant cognitivist approaches that we have in second language acquisition today. I want to conclude, however, by asking this question here. Well, what are the pedagogical implications of cognitivist approaches, right? How do we see these things realized in the classroom? One way that we see these things realized is through what's called task-based teaching, or TBT, right? In task-based teaching, what we're doing is we're giving our students problems to solve that mirror real-world usage or authentic usage of that language. So in a task-based teaching approach, instead of just teaching our students things like directions in a basic ESL tutorial, instead of teaching them things like north, south, east, west, straight, left, right, instead what we do is we give them a task where they have to navigate the town using the English language. Now, we might do this through simulation. We might not actually kick our students out of the classroom and say, okay, make it back. But we may simulate this using maps and model cars and other realia to help make that happen. The important thing about task-based teaching, beyond the fact that we're asking students to solve real-world problems or tasks, right? Oftentimes in a simulated environment, is that task-based teaching follows a very specific structure. We begin with the pre-task, and this is where the teacher sets up the parameters for the task that the students are to carry out. It may also be where much of the scaffolding for that task occurs. So this, during the pre-task element, this is where we'd be doing things like introducing new vocabulary, right? This is where we'd be doing things like introducing certain question structures. For example, how do I get to versus where is, right? As well as introducing students to alternative ways that response to these questions might happen. For example, if you're on the Tacoma Park campus and you're talking to a security guard, you might ask the question, where is the parking garage? Or how do I get to the parking garage? And you may receive different responses to the same question. One security guard might say, go out the doors, turn right, walk to the end of the street, turn left at the next intersection, and it'll be right in front of you. Another security guard might say, you're going to want to head east out of these doors until you get to the first intersection. At the first intersection, turn north, proceed north until you see a sign that says parking garage, right? So we'll be doing things like this during the pre-task, not just going over vocabulary items, but also going over different forms that responses and inquiries might take related to that task. Then we have the task itself. And during the task stage of task-based teaching, this is where the teacher typically removes themselves from the learning encounter as an active participant and begins to just observe, right? So during the task part, the students are oftentimes working in groups to address the language learning task that they've been tasked with, that they've been situated in front of, and the teacher is observing the interactions between students and the language being produced, and oftentimes taking a lot of notes because they'll use these notes during the post-task, right? Now, during this stage, the teacher is also on hand to provide support to the learners if they have questions, but it's important that the teacher isn't giving away any answers here, right? During the post-task, in simulation gaming, we would call this the debriefing, but during the post-task, the teacher then sort of resumes explicit control over the educational encounter by calling students' attentions to specific forms and offering feedback. We'll talk about different kinds of feedback later, I guess. Offering feedback on the language that was produced during the task. And you may be familiar with task-based teaching. You may have encountered it in your own language teaching or in your own language learning. You may have encountered in other educational contexts, task-based teaching is actually surprisingly popular and is still around in many different forms today. Now, beyond this specific pedagogical framework, there are a number of strategies that are typically targeted during that are oftentimes targeted during instructional intervention, right? So we'll oftentimes target specific cognitive strategies for our students, right? And the attempt here is to oftentimes either model how to use these strategies to address new language tasks, or to give students practice with them, right? And we'll change that for now to say learning strategies, because we're going to break these down into 3 different categories. There are metacognitive strategies, so strategies that rely on getting the student to think about what they're doing, to think about language, to think about what they're producing. This would be things like selective attention, right? So setting up a task in a way that primes students to attend to certain elements of that task. For example, giving students a keywords list and a listening task and having them mark how many times they hear a particular keyword during that listening task. This can also be things like planning, very commonly used, or I should say very extensively used in writing classes, where we often give students time to pre-plan the work that they're doing. Also includes things like monitoring. This goes back to Krashen's monitoring hypothesis, as well as evaluation. So things like asking students to make judgments about the appropriateness of certain utterances. We then also have various cognitive strategies that we might see learning activities attempt to target. These may be things like rehearsal, which is pretty self-explanatory, right? Providing students with space to practice a particular communicative skill before actually having to apply it. So we can see already how that would interface with the pre-task, task, post-task design. We may have students practice how to pronounce certain new terms during the pre-task and then actually using them during the task. This can also include things like having students drawing inferences about language or summarizing their learning explicitly, oftentimes through the use of reflective writing. And then, understand that these aren't exhaustive lists, but there's also social or affective strategies, right? So we may have activities that require students to cooperate with each other and to negotiate meaning. We may also task them with an activity that we know there will be elements that are beyond their current abilities that will then require them to engage in a form of repair as they're interacting with their classmates, right? So we may have, for example, a lesson on how to ask for clarification, right? Polite ways of asking for clarification during communication. And then we create an activity where students will have to work together to negotiate meaning and to use those repair strategies to ensure that they get that final intended meaning. Okay, we'll look at a lot more. We'll see a lot of pedagogies discussed throughout the course of this term, but one of the things I want you to start thinking about is when we encounter a pedagogy or a learning task, where is it coming from, right? What is that sort of theoretical antecedent to it? And now we have a pretty good understanding of a cognitivist approach to second language acquisition, so you should be able to start to see fingerprints of this on some tasks. That being said, the cognitivist approach has seen considerable critique in the past, what would that be, 20, 30 years, in large part because cognitivist approaches attempt to completely divorce the learner from the social context. Pure cognitivist approaches would say social context doesn't matter in language learning, language acquisition, or language use, right? Purely cognitivist approaches would say that the internal state of the learner has little real impact on language learning and acquisition, and there are many researchers out there that say this simply isn't the case, right? Something like self-identity or subjectivity can have a profound impact on second language acquisition, right? For example, if we have an individual who in their home country was a highly skilled laborer, perhaps they were a lawyer or a doctor, and then they migrate to the US or they're a refugee, and now all of a sudden they can't practice law because they don't know how to practice law in English. They don't have that linguistic ability to practice law in this new context, right? If this learner has a great deal of sort of investment in that professional identity of lawyer, it may actually be very challenging to get that learner to be successful in the language classroom because they have this very strong sense of former self, and that kind of sense of loss and some might say trauma of that loss will prevent them from successfully engaging in second language acquisition in instructional environments, right? So we'll start looking at some of the responses to cognitivist approaches during the rest of our time here this semester. Now, I have talked more than long enough. You all have a good one, and I'll see you in person next week.